Understanding China has become more difficult than ever, yet also more important than ever. Whether the U.S. and China are rivals, partners, or a mix of both, effective policy will only be as good as the information on which it is based. My name is Scott Kennedy, and I'm the Senior Advisor and Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I also have had the privilege of being one of the few American scholars who has traveled back and forth between Washington and Beijing in recent years. I'm a firm believer that field research, direct observation, talking, and listening to Chinese perspectives must be a part of our toolkit to understand the People's Republic of China. So join me as I speak with Chinese leaders from business, government, and academia, and foreigners who have spent many years living and working in China. What makes China tick? Where is the country going? What connects us? And what divides us? We'll dive into all of that and more on this podcast. Welcome to China Field Notes. Hello, this is Scott Kennedy, and welcome to China Field Notes. We are joined on today's program by Jack Chang, who recently retired from Taiwan's Industrial Technology Research Institute, or ITRI, which is recognized as one of the world's top institutes for information and communications technologies, both their research and how to bring them to market. Jack most recently was Senior Strategy Executive Director for Sustainability. He also serves as an adjunct professor at the Graduate Institute of Patents at the National Taiwan University of Science and Technology in Taipei. And Jack is one of the most knowledgeable people on the planet that I know who understands Taiwan's semiconductor industry, a sector that sits at the center of several major challenges between technology innovation and national security, globalization and supply chain resilience, and of course, U.S. China relations. So Jack, welcome to China Field Notes.
Yes, thank you, Scott, for the invitation.
Well, I'm so glad that we've had this chance to get together to talk because we've known each other a really long time and you've taught me a lot over the years and I really appreciate it. And I think the world really needs to learn a lot from you, can learn a lot from you. And so I'm just delighted to have this conversation with a true expert about this industry. I follow it, I write about it, but you probably forget more in a day than I've ever learned in my entire life about this industry.
I really don't think so.
Honestly, yes. We're going to have a great conversation. Maybe you could just help us get started by explaining, how did you get interested in technologies and semiconductors to begin with?
I am a chemical engineer. And as you mentioned, I have been worked in ITRI for 34 years until my recent retirement. And ITRI is one of the largest applied research organizations in Taiwan. So to fulfill our mission, we need to understand the unmet need of the local companies and formulate R&D project to fill the gap of those technology. So I was in charge of industrial analysis and market research project in ITRI, which allowed me to talk to local tech companies to understand their unmet need. So use semiconductor industry as an example. Semiconductor manufacturing use a lot of chemicals and materials, such as silicon wafer, high purity electronic chemicals and materials. So one of the early R&D projects I involved in ITRI is to develop high purity electronic chemicals and materials for the industry. So I need to talk to the local companies to understand their needs. So it's becoming the starting point for my long career to study the high-tech industry, including semiconductors in Taiwan.
What you just said immediately distinguishes you from me. So when I was in high school, I was interested in chemistry and I originally was going to apply to college to study chemical engineering, but I didn't. I got interested in China and my life changed. And luckily, though, you stuck with it and we're all your students. So since you've worked at ITRI a long time and you've had this seat to view the evolution of Taiwan's semiconductor industry for these many years, can you give our audience a summary of how it is that Taiwan went from making screens and games and putting together laptops to becoming such a powerhouse in semiconductors?
I think it's a deliberate design from our government. I think in 1974, American Chinese electrical engineering in the name of Pan Wenyan, who convened overseas scholars in the United States to form the Electronic Technology Advisory Committee, or we call TAC. And they selected the RCA as a technology transfer partners to introduce its CMOS technology to Taiwan. So following their recommendations, so the government commissioned ITRI in 1976 to send a 19-member team, after recruitment and training to RCA to learn and transfer the technology back to Taiwan. So after they returned to Taiwan, they successfully repeat the RCA technology they transferred and establish related technology research project in Taiwan. So after the completion of the technology, since it's so new in Taiwan at that time, so the government asked ITRI to spin off companies according to the technology they developed. So they spin off UMC in 1980, TSMC in 1987, and Vanguard International Semiconductor Corporation in 1994. So that's becoming maybe the starting point for Taiwan to evolve and play a more important role in the global semiconductor industry.
So that is really interesting how it got off the ground, sort of a combination of government guidance and support and then researchers who then implemented this plan. But the way the world looks today is not how it looked in the 1980s, right? At that point, we had sort of integrated semiconductor companies that would design a semiconductor, they would manufacture it or fabricate it, and they would maybe be involved in other parts. The semiconductor industry has really changed and become much more specialized. How has Taiwan been able to become so central to this much more specialized, globally distributed industry?
As I mentioned, I think we go through a different stage of the development. So I think you put it together, I think it's a mixture of luck, good timing, technical skills, and hard working to make Taiwan maintain or regain our positions in the semiconductor industry today. And nowadays, I think we produce about 60% of the world's chips, including about 90% of the most advanced chips used in your PC, smartphone, or AI applications nowadays. So I think for Taiwan to maintain our competitive edge, I think one important thing is TSMC. TSMC, as I mentioned, was established in 1987 and headquarters in Hsinchu Science Park, which is about 10 kilometers away from our ITRI campus in Hsinchu. And Morris Chang was the TSMC's chairman who pioneered the pure play foundry business model, with an exclusive focus on manufacturing its customers' products. That means, TSMC does not have its own brand. He only provide, manufacturing service to his customers. And most of his customers are the so-called fabless or the IC design companies. A lot of them are American companies, for example, like the chips Apple's using in their smartphones and PCs, NVIDIA's, Qualcomm, Broadcom, etc. So from those service provided by TSMC, those IC design companies can obtain their chips, or their most advanced product from TSMC, and then they will sell those chips under their own brand. So although, as I mentioned, TSMC produce maybe about 90% of the most advanced chips, but those chips were shipped back to their customers, and the customers sell them, by themselves through their channels. So in that sense, from our statistics, USA now is the number one in terms of the semiconductor revenues. It's account for maybe about 38% of the global market share, but Taiwan only account for about 21 and ranked number 2. And South Korea ranked number 3, about 18%, and followed by Japan, China, and EU.
So even though Taiwan now dominates in manufacturing, there's other parts of the supply chain upstream at the design level or downstream, the brands and the products where others are still doing extremely well. And this division of labor has ended up being beneficial for everybody. Is that how you see it?
Yes. As you mentioned, I think semiconductor industry can be divided into the IC design, the manufacturing, and testing and packaging. So it creates a very complicated supply chain. So the major players in the supply chain, for example, in the IC design stage, you need to have EDA tools. Okay, those are provided, for example, by Cadence, some other U.S. companies, and used for IC design. And also in the fabrication, for example, as a use TSMC example, they need chemicals, materials, and equipment. Okay, for the manufacturing. U.S., European, and Japanese companies are the major providers of those high purity chemicals and equipments. It's also the same thing for the IC testing and packaging. So there are thousands of companies involved in the global semiconductor supply chain, and no single country in the world, okay, can sustain by herself. So therefore, I think maintain a globalized supply chain and market by division of labor, as you mentioned, I think is vital for the sustainable development of the semiconductor industry.
Recently, Jensen Huang of NVIDIA visited Taiwan to great fanfare. I don't know if Jensen Huang, if he walked down the streets in Washington, D.C. or in Los Angeles, would be recognized. But in Taiwan, he must be seen as a superhero along the lines of Morris Chang. What is the view of semiconductor entrepreneurs and leaders when someone like Jensen Huang speaks in Taiwan? How much attention do they get?
I think Jack Chang is like a superstar nowadays in Taiwan. I think people are interested in him because of the successful story of the NVIDIA, also about her personal fortune. The stock price of NVIDIA soared so many times in the last few years. So I think he has been used as a successful entrepreneur or examples in Taiwan, and people are interested about in successful stories. Aside from that, I think he grew up in Taiwan and he loved Taiwan. So he become a very important international figures, okay, in the international arena to promote Taiwan. So I think Jason is one of the few entrepreneurs that I see when they succeed, they will come back to Taiwan and share his gratitude to his partners who work very closely for him, okay, in Taiwan. My personal point of view, I think we have a culture to show our appreciation, and we are interested about successful stories. So I think Jason is the mixture, okay, combine all those characteristics. So he's some kind of attraction to local people.
For sure. In the United States, one of the most commonly heard words these days is resilience. You hear that applied to many different industries and technologies. When I visited Taiwan over the last few years, I've also heard Taiwanese talk about what a resilient semiconductor industry. What do you think is most important for Taiwan to have its own resilient semiconductor industry or to keep making progress in the years to come? It has this significant lead in manufacturing, but as you know, industries change and evolve. How do people in Taiwan think about resilience and maintaining progress?
So I think the COVID-19 pandemic and also the post-pandemic economic effects and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine has exposed the vulnerability of today's global supply chain. So use semiconductor industry as an example. So we experienced IC shortage crisis during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a wake-up call, I think, for the global semiconductor supply chain. So before the pandemic, all the industry, they are focusing on the so-called lean supply chain. So they use the word just in time, okay, to minimize inventory and to lower costs for the production. But after the crisis, they are thinking about if we don't have any stock, the inventory, then if something happened to the disruption for the supply chain, so they are using a new model just called just in case. If something happened, what should I do to overcome the disruption? From that concept, I think resilience start to play a role. The resilience means, okay, you can have something, if something bad happen, then you can use the minimum resources to maintain your operation without any disruption and come back to normal operation afterwards. So we use the word resilient to describe that kind of scenarios. So for semiconductor industry, I think after the pandemic, lots of countries view semiconductors as strategic resources and have launched semiconductor-related incentive policies. For example, as you know, in U.S., you have the Chips and Science Act. In Europe, they have the Chip Act of EU. And South Korea also announced their K-semiconductor strategies. And Japan has their emergency strengthen plan for semiconductor industry. So all those companies try to create their own manufacturing capabilities. Nowadays, try to avoid the chip shortage crisis they experienced during the pandemic. And companies likewise, try to enhance the resilience of their supply chain, which allows the supply chain to recover quickly from an unexpected event. So I think that's the basic background. Companies talking about resilience nowadays.
So in the case of just the island of Taiwan, is that resilience reflected in the expansion of the number of fabs or greater access, assured access to chemicals and materials or other kinds of things? You know, Taiwan also has a relatively small population and only a certain number of engineers. How does Taiwan itself maintain a resilient industry on the island itself?
First, I think for the semiconductor, I think TSMC start to invest overseas. According to the requirement, I think by those chips-related act I mentioned previously. So they announced to build most advanced fabs in Arizona, United States, and more mature node in both Japan and Germany. As I mentioned, prior to the pandemic, we are thinking about globalization, and China has become the global factory. But after the pandemic, as well as the U.S. China trade war and technology wars, so companies try to move away from China and try to diversify their production sites. So I think TSMC's investment is, I think, conform to those trends. And TSMC also announced, they are still rooted in Taiwan, so they will develop their most advanced nodes in Taiwan. For example, they developed 2 nanometer, fabs in Hsinchu in northern Taiwan, 3 to 5 nanometer fab in Kaohsiung in southern Taiwan, and 7 nanometer fab in Taichung in central Taiwan. So from my personal perspective, I think it's a diversification. I think it's good for TSMC to enhance their resilience in case something happens. For example, an earthquake in Taiwan, they might disturb their production in Taiwan, but their overseas fab can take over and maintain their commitment to their customers.
In fact, there was an earthquake earlier this year in Taiwan, and TSMC was shut down for a few hours, but they were back up very quickly, right?
Yeah.
They are adapting. Hey, if it's okay with you, I wanted to ask a question about China, since you mentioned them, because everyone is aware of Chinese investments in chip manufacturing, design. If you've heard of resilience in Washington, you've also heard of October 7th in Washington, when restrictions were placed on China in the semiconductor space. What's your evaluation of Chinese capabilities in semiconductors? Are they a significant challenge, or are they improving very quickly? Is October 7 and subsequent rules slowing them down?
I think for the October 7th rule, I think the U.S. tried to prohibit China to develop the most advanced semiconductor technology. In that word, advanced, I mean something below 14 nanometers. So due to the U.S. restrictions, I think Chinese government has focused on develop for the so-called traditional or mature node, especially since somewhere around 28 nanometers. So they, according to some of the statistics I found, I think China has invested a lot of money try to develop so-called the mature node, and they, from my statistics, they will add 18 new wafer fabs in 2024 with a monthly production capacity about 8.6 million wafers. So, which represent an annual increase about 13%, which is twice about global growth rate about 6.4%. So I think in few months ago, I think U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo has said that China is pouring a lot of money into subsidizing mature chips with overcapacity. This is an issue we need to think about and solve with our allies. So I think these mature chips are widely used in smartphones, electronic vehicles, and military hardware equipment. So facing the threat from China, I think nowadays we are worried about maybe there's overcapacity in so-called the mature node, the legacy chip, maybe somewhere from nowadays to 2027. So most of Taiwanese companies are thinking about they need to differentiate their product from their Chinese competitors and maintain a technology edge over them for them to be able to survive. But I think we don't worry about the most advanced node because, as I mentioned, TSMC occupy maybe more than 90%, and Samsung and Intel maybe the other 10%.
You mentioned that TSMC has been investing abroad, including in Arizona. Famously, a few years ago, he raised doubts about the ability of the United States to become successful again in advanced manufacturing. Since then, though, the TSMC factory in Arizona has moved along and continued to make progress. A lot of Taiwanese employees of TSMC have been there helping train American employees, and we're seeing fabs by Intel, be developed in Ohio and others. Do you think that the U.S. can successfully become a bigger player in manufacturing semiconductors again? Or do you think that this is something that is idealistic and is not going to result in progress, and instead it'll be wasted billions of dollars?
I think for TSMC to make an overseas investment, I think the most important criteria is they get support from their customers. That means if they establish a fab in Arizona, then they need to have their commitment from their U.S. customers. They say they will place orders in those fabs. As you mentioned, to run a fab in Arizona is much expensive than the one in Taiwan. That means, their U.S. customers are willing to pay higher premium to secure a domestic production. So I think that's the main reason for TSMC to do that. Aside from the support from their customers, I think all the investment made by TSMC in both in US, in Japan, and in Germany, they also receive a huge amount of subsidy from the local government. For example, the US government has provided, according to the Chips and Science Act, has provided up to about 6.6 billion in direct financial assistance to TSMC's Arizona fab. They may also provide up to about 5 billion in loan. So therefore, I think you got support from the host countries, from their customers. Also, some of the fab are joint investment among TSMC and their customers. I think the risk for those investments should be very low.
So if we are looking out 5 years, maybe 10 years in the semiconductor industry, what do you think will be most different about it in 5 or 10 years? What do you think is likely to just be the same? What should we be expecting down the road?
As I mentioned, semiconductor industry is a very complicated supply chain. For countries to secure a manufacturing fab, they need a lot of factors to do that, because a fab is a capital, technology, and energy and human resource intensive operations. So I think nowadays in the world, only few countries can satisfy all those requirements. So I see we now only have fab in maybe most of them are focusing in Asia areas, in Taiwan, in China, in Japan, in Korea, as well as I think in United States and in EU. Most of them is in Germany. So a lot of countries are thinking about they want to establish a fab. Singapore is doing that pretty good, but I don't think too many countries can join the rank. So I think you need to think about what's your strengths and what you do. For example, when I was consulted by some countries, I suggested that maybe they need to think about to go for IC design or go to testing and packaging, depend on their respective strengths and competitiveness. So I think it's not easy to develop an IC fab, okay, in your soil unless you meet those requirements I mentioned.
So it sounds like from a geographic perspective, the barriers to entry are pretty high, and that we're not going to see a fundamental shift with all of the elements of the industry shifting to either just one of the countries that are significant now or some new player. In terms of the underlying technology of chips, you mentioned you're a chemical engineer, you've worked a lot on materials. People have talked about a post-silicon world or getting below 2 nanometers. How far away are we from that kind of revolution in materials and computation?
I think nowadays, in the semiconductor industry, there are two different technology routes. One is the Moore's rule. That means, okay, for every 18 months, the number of transistors in the wafer will increase. So as you can see, that's what TSMC is doing nowadays, okay, from 7 nanometers to 5 nanometers to 3 nanometers to 2 nanometers to 1 nanometer. And now they are thinking about going to the angstrom. So, but there's another route we call the modern Moore's. That means, okay, I don't go to those advanced nodes, but I use, for example, 3D stacking or chiplet or some other technologies, okay, to manufacture chips, okay, to satisfy different demand. Aside from that, I think we call the third generation semiconductor, because nowadays the semiconductor we're talking about is based on silicon. Now, for the third generation, is based on the other base material like germanium. So all those, they have the characteristic about to endure high voltage, high currency. So they are being using, for example, in the EVs. So it's a new technology route, but they don't require advanced, okay, technology. So that's why I think it will not like the semiconductor. So lots of countries are thinking about going to that type of semiconductors.
Well, this is very exciting. We've discussed a lot of the challenges that have been brought about because of COVID or geopolitics, but also an amazing evolution of the industry, which has had a transformative effect on the entire world. And also some potentially really interesting developments coming forward. And because it's innovation, we don't know what is going to ultimately be successful. But Jack, I really appreciate you spending some time with us today, helping us look back, look at the present, and look forward. Thank you for joining us on China Field Notes.
Okay, thank you, Scott.
Thanks for listening to China Field Notes. Stay up to date with our latest releases by following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to great content. Until next time.